Before dawn on Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1666, London was still a city built out of habits older than memory. It was a city of timber and pitch, of overhanging upper stories and narrow lanes, of workshops tucked under sleeping rooms, of warehouses stuffed with oil, hemp, tar, sugar, pepper, gunpowder, books, cloth, and hope. It was a city that had survived plague only the year before, a city still counting its dead from one disaster when another, hotter and brighter, was preparing itself in a baker's house on Pudding Lane. When the fire began, no one in that first confused hour could have known that they were standing inside one of the most famous urban catastrophes in history. They heard a cry, smelled smoke, saw an orange edge under a door, perhaps felt the ordinary jolt of alarm that city dwellers know when flame appears where it should not. A fire in London was not unusual. Houses burned, shops burned, warehouses burned, chimneys failed, candles overturned, ovens threw sparks. The city possessed buckets, hand squirts, hooks, ladders, parish engines, and above all a method that Londoners trusted because it had often worked before: tear down buildings around the blaze and starve it of fuel. But this fire began at the wrong place, in the wrong weather, in a city built in the wrong way, under a sky and a wind that turned accident into force. By the time the people of London understood that this was not an ordinary urban fire, but a moving catastrophe, the blaze had already learned the city's shape. It had found the warehouses along the river. It had found the lanes that acted like chimneys. It had found the dry timber of a long, hot summer. It had found hesitation in men whose first responsibility should have been speed. And once it found those things, it ceased to be an event that London was managing and became an event that London was trying to survive. The Great Fire of London lasted not merely 4 days in the calendar sense, but 4 different ages in the mind. The first age was disbelief. The second was panic. The third was adaptation. The fourth was reckoning. To say that the fire remade London is true, but it understates the violence with which the city had to pass from one version of itself to another. What burned between Sunday morning and Wednesday night was more than property. Streets that had carried the routines of commerce and devotion for generations vanished into a geography of ash. Parish identities were ripped out of the map. Guild halls, shops, counting houses, taverns, warehouses, alleys, courts, church interiors, bells, records, and the accumulated textures of medieval London disappeared in a storm of sparks large enough to be seen for miles. Yet the Great Fire is not only a story of destruction. It is also a story of administration under pressure, of monarchy tested in public, of rumor, blame, and anti-foreign violence, of the city's social hierarchy made visible in flight, of the birth of modern urban risk, of insurance and rebuilding, of law courts improvising a new property order, and of how catastrophe can become memory so powerful that centuries later the event still seems hotter than many wars. To understand what the fire changed, one has to begin with the city it found. Restoration London in 1666 was already crowded, ambitious, and precarious. It was the capital of a restored monarchy and the commercial heart of a kingdom at war with the Dutch. Its riverfront pulsed with Atlantic trade and imperial beginnings. Goods from around the world came through London and lodged inside a physical environment still shaped by medieval boundaries and medieval building practice. Inside the old city walls, space was compressed. Houses leaned over streets. Upper floors nearly touched. Workshops and homes shared structures. Storehouses held combustible material in alarming concentration. The legal order of property was intricate, but the practical reality of the city was intimate chaos. People lived close enough to hear one another breathe through thin partitions, close enough to smell one another's dinners, close enough that when flame took hold in one building it could, under the right wind, leap to the next as if the city had been built for fire's convenience. London had no modern fire brigade, no centralized command structure for disaster, no urban planning logic capable of quick containment once a blaze grew beyond the scale of parish response. It had a mayor, alderman, royal authority at some distance, local custom, and a great deal of dependence on the initiative of individuals. In ordinary times, that mix sustained the city. In extraordinary times, it could fail with terrible speed. The fire began around 1 in the morning in the bakery of Thomas Farriner, or Farinor as the spelling often appears, on Pudding Lane, near the Thames. The exact mechanics of ignition remain uncertain. London Museum notes that it may have been a spark from one of Farinor's ovens, though certainty is impossible after so much heat and so much time. But while the microscopic cause can never be entirely recovered, the larger conditions are plain enough. September opened after a long dry spell. Timber, thatch, shutters, and beams had lost moisture. The easterly wind that blew through the city did not merely feed the fire. It drove it westward into the dense body of the city. Farinor and his household escaped over rooftops, except for a maid who reportedly did not get out. In the immediate vicinity, neighbors woke, shouted, hauled buckets, and did what Londoners were accustomed to doing. Some tried to save goods before flames spread. Some tried to block passageways. Some watched a little too long, as human beings always do when disaster is near enough to fascinate, but not yet near enough to command surrender. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was summoned. He came, assessed, and fatally failed. The right response at that hour was demolition. Buildings had to come down fast, with authority, before the wind pushed the blaze beyond local control. Instead, Bloodworth hesitated, reportedly dismissing the danger in words history has preserved because they now seem so ruinously small. Whether the exact phrase attributed to him was spoken precisely as remembered matters less than the truth behind it. He did not act with the speed catastrophe required. In a city where property rights were strong and demolition was expensive, frightening, and politically dangerous, hesitation was understandable at the human scale. At the scale of urban fire, it was devastating. Fire in a timber city behaves like thought in a crowded mind. It does not move in one line. It advances, splits, circles, leaps, and returns. Sparks carried by wind created new ignitions ahead of the main blaze. As the flames found warehouses near the river stocked with oil, tallow, spirits, resin, and other goods ready to magnify heat, the fire grew from neighborhood emergency into systemic threat. It began eating not just houses, but fuel depots disguised as ordinary commerce. The Thames, which might seem a natural barrier, provided no simple rescue because the riverfront itself was lined with wharves and storehouses. Burning materials rolled, burst, and carried flame in multiple directions. Boats became routes of escape and routes for moving goods, but they could not extinguish an inferno running through the city's economic bloodstream. By dawn on Sunday, the fire had already outrun the assumptions with which London had first met it. The first great transformation of the disaster came in the mind. A fire becomes a catastrophe at the moment when people stop asking whether it can be put out and begin asking what must be saved before it reaches them. That shift is moral as much as practical. Under ordinary civic danger, one still belongs to a community managing an event. Under catastrophic danger, one is pulled toward household, family, records, money, plate, portable wealth, children, books, trunks, tools, and whatever else can be moved. The city atomizes. Streets fill not only with firefighters, but with those carrying chests, bundles, bedding, caged birds, ledgers, icons of memory, and the furniture by which they measure respectability. Pepys, whose diary remains one of the greatest windows into the fire, woke to reports and first did not grasp the scale. From the tower, he saw the blaze spreading. His entries catch that changing comprehension. A citizen at first curious, then alarmed, then frantic in the practical way of a man protecting household, papers, wine, and status while also serving the state. What makes Pepys invaluable is not merely that he tells us what happened. It is that he lets us watch one intelligent observer adjust too slowly and then with increasing speed, exactly as the city did. Sunday, the first full day of the fire, became a race between official recognition and the rate of spread. King Charles II and his brother James, Duke of York, were drawn into the crisis, not because monarchs in 17th century England functioned as modern emergency managers, but because the city's own machinery had failed to make the first ruthless decisions. The monarchy could authorize demolition with fewer local scruples. It could override hesitation. But messages moved at the speed of horses and feet, while the fire moved at the speed of a gale across dry timber. Every hour lost in the first phase had compounding effects. By the time royal energy and direction fully entered the struggle, the city had already given the blaze too much continuity. James in particular earned later praise for practical courage, riding into danger, organizing firefighting and demolition, and attempting to impose order amid fear. Charles too appeared in the crisis, trying to steady both citizens and officials. These royal interventions mattered politically because the Restoration monarchy still lived with memories of civil war, regicide, and distrust. A king who vanished during disaster might appear ornamental. A king who showed himself amid danger could make majesty useful. The Great Fire thus became a test not just of London, but of Restoration government. Could crown and city together protect the capital? At first, the answer looked dangerously uncertain. The physical scene on Sunday was one of layered noise and contradictory motion. Bells rang. Orders were shouted. Axes fell on houses selected for demolition. Too few and too late. Residents bargained with laborers to save particular buildings or goods. Water was hauled and wasted against heat too intense for parish methods. The streets clogged with carts and human bodies. Some sought the river, believing the open water or the opposite bank offered safety. Others pushed north into fields beyond the city where goods piled up in improvised camps. The poor carried what they could on their backs. The rich hired carts, wagons, and porters if they could still command them. Servants ran errands that changed by the hour because the line of danger moved by the hour. Parish churches became temporary storehouses and then themselves entered the path of destruction. The city, ordinarily governed by routine distinctions of class and corporate identity, was being resorted by proximity to heat. To later generations, the fire's map can seem predetermined. It started in the east, moved west through the city, consumed St. Paul's, then weakened. But for those inside it, the future was uncertain at every stage. Wind might shift. Demolition might work. A lane might hold. A churchyard might provide a break. A river channel might stop spread. Then the opposite would occur. Sparks leapt. Wooden hoardings caught. Hay, paper, pitch, and cloth transformed whole blocks into connected combustion. This uncertainty made rumor almost inevitable. If no one could see the whole fire, then everyone explained the parts they saw through fear, politics, and wartime imagination. England was at war with the Dutch, and anti-foreign suspicion already ran high. Fires of such scale often invite narratives of plot because accident seems morally insufficient. How could mere flame produce such ruin without hostile intention? Foreigners, Catholics, the poor, the unlucky, and the merely conspicuous would all become vulnerable to the city's need for an enemy. Disaster creates smoke in the streets and smoke in the mind. Pepys's Sunday describes the city's change of scale with particular force. At first he moves through ordinary urban channels: office, river, conversation, household instructions. Then the fire invades every category. He sends away belongings. He assesses what to bury, what to transport, what to preserve. He watches the horizon of flame broaden. This is one of the most revealing aspects of the Great Fire. It was an urban disaster experienced through domestic decision. London did not empty all at once. It emptied by household calculus. What do you take first? Plate, cash, papers proving ownership, clothes, food, bedding, books, tools, children? The answer depended on class, occupation, and imagination. Some carried signs of respectability because respectability itself might be needed if one ended as a refugee in fields. Others carried instruments of trade because survival tomorrow depended on labor, not silver. Still others carried sacred objects or family relics because identity under catastrophe clings to symbols even when practical sense protests. Monday was the day the fire became imperial in appetite. Sunday had been terror. Monday was recognition. By then, many Londoners understood that entire districts were doomed, but even that understanding underestimated what was coming. The wind held. The blaze moved westward and northward with horrifying vigor. It devoured streets whose names had anchored commercial and civic life. Warehouses erupted. Shops exploded into cinders. The city's great machine of trade fed the thing that was destroying it. This is why the fire remade London rather than merely damaging it. It burned through the infrastructure of urban identity. Not just residences, but the connective tissue of markets, parishes, and corporate life vanished. Fire does not erase social hierarchy, but it can expose how much hierarchy depends on architecture. Remove the counting house, the guild hall, the parish church, the the lane of apprentices, the familiar alehouse, the known address, and suddenly citizenship itself feels less solid. One of the most dramatic symbolic casualties of the fire was Old St. Paul's Cathedral. Medieval St. Paul's was not merely a church. It was an urban world, a religious center, a landmark, a spatial and spiritual orientation point. Yet on Monday and into Tuesday, it too fell within the fire's logic. The common story long held that booksellers storing their stock in St. Paul's, believing the great stone structure safe, helped seal its destruction when flames found the timber scaffolds and combustible materials associated with repairs. Whether or not this narrative has been simplified over time, the result remains. The cathedral, repository of memory and prestige, burned. Lead ran molten in the streets. The roof failed. The building became one of the fire's iconic victims, and with it a piece of old London's mental architecture collapsed. To see St. Paul's burn was to realize that size, sanctity, and stone were not enough. If the cathedral could go, what could not? This same day also laid bare the city's politics of desperation. Crowds searched for culprits. Foreigners were attacked. People suspected of throwing fireballs or speaking with the wrong accent became targets of rage. Anti-Catholic and anti-Dutch sentiment, already present in Restoration England, mixed with the need to personify catastrophe. It was easier, in the heat of smoke and exile, to imagine enemies than meteorology, bad building practice, administrative failure, and the random cruelty of sparks. The authorities had to manage not only fire but violence. James, Duke of York, gained admiration partly because he appears in accounts attempting both firefighting and crowd control, exerting himself as if the monarchy's physical presence might substitute for the city's failing systems. Here again, the Great Fire acted as political theater in the harshest sense. Rule had to be enacted in burning streets. Orders shouted from safe chambers would not suffice. Monday also reveals the importance of river and field as counter-city. As the fire consumed the built environment, Londoners fled toward spaces not yet structured by dense urban fuel. The Thames filled with boats carrying goods and people. Moorfields and other open areas north of the city became landscapes of displacement. There, under the open sky, merchants and householders turned fields into temporary warehouses, refugee camps, and outdoor counting houses. Goods were heaped in precarious safety. Trunks, bales, bedsteads, desks, paintings, account books, barrels, cages, clothing, and all the mixed material by which a city reproduces itself. Catastrophe does not reduce life to pure essentials. It exposes how much people consider essential when given only one or two chances to choose. The fields around London became museums of interrupted daily life. They also became scenes of vulnerability. Protection was uncertain. Theft was feared. Weather threatened. Those who had escaped fire now had to survive exposure and insecurity. The Great Fire did not merely burn London. It displaced London into the spaces around itself and forced the capital's social order to camp in the open while its center glowed behind it. If Monday was the day of recognition, Tuesday was the day of strategy. By then the fire's path had become so enormous that ordinary urban instinct was useless. The question was no longer how to extinguish flames directly, but how to change the city around them faster than they could move. Demolition, finally pursued at a scale befitting the danger, became the central weapon. Houses were blown up with gunpowder to create fire breaks, a method more violent and politically risky than pulling buildings down by hooks and labor, but also more effective under crisis conditions. This choice tells us something profound about urban order. Property, in ordinary times, is protected by law, sentiment, and custom. Under catastrophic fire, the city may have to be destroyed in order to survive itself. Officials now accepted a logic they had delayed on Sunday. Better the deliberate loss of some buildings than the uncontrolled loss of everything. The tragedy of the Great Fire is that this logic was correct and late. Earlier, it might have saved more. Now it would save what remained. The weather, that old tyrant of pre-modern life, at last offered some relief. Winds began to ease. Fire breaks held in places where before they would have failed. The combined effect of weakening wind and stronger demolition gradually altered the balance. But even as the fire's expansion slowed, the city continued to burn on a scale almost impossible to narrate soberly. Whole vistas collapsed. Church towers failed. Streets became channels of embers. Valuable stock, not all of it movable in time, went up in sparks. The financial loss was extraordinary not merely because London was rich, but because wealth in 17th-century cities often sat in materials highly vulnerable to flame. Timber buildings, paper records, stored commodities, wooden ships and wharves, cloth, alcohol, spices, furniture, and artisanal tools. Tuesday also sharpened the crisis of record. Merchants, lawyers, civic officers, and churchmen understood that documents could matter as much as plate. Deeds, leases, wills, account books, parish registers, and commercial correspondence underwrote claims on the future. Fire that destroyed a house could be rebuilt around if ownership was clear and credit recoverable. Fire that destroyed the proofs of ownership, debt, and obligation struck deeper into the legal skeleton of the city. This helps explain the frantic efforts to save paper and the later importance of special legal machinery for resolving post-fire disputes. Catastrophe in a commercial city is never only material. It is archival. A burned ledger is a burned relationship between past and future. There is also, in Tuesday's struggle, a lesson about command. By this stage, the monarchy was more fully engaged, the Duke of York's energy more decisive, the city's officials more willing to authorize destructive salvation. The contrast with the first hours haunted later memory. Had London been failed by its mayor? By municipal caution? By property culture? By the very density and prosperity that had made the city what it was? All of these answers carry some truth. The Great Fire entered English political thought partly as a case study in delayed action. Disaster often clarifies what institutions are for by showing what happens when they act too slowly. The Lord Mayor's hesitation became legendary not simply because one man can explain a city-wide catastrophe, but because crisis invites dramatic condensation. History wants a face for failure. Yet if Bloodworth became that face, it should not absolve the wider urban system that made such hesitation likely. In 17th-century London, tearing down a citizen's house without clear authority risked lawsuits, fury, and enormous financial consequences. The city had built a legal and economic order that prized property and local jurisdiction. Those principles made prosperity possible. They also made emergency decisiveness harder than later commentators like to admit. The Great Fire revealed the paradox at the heart of urban liberty. The same respect for ownership and distributed power that nourishes a city in peace may endanger it under sudden physical threat if no stronger emergency logic is available. As Tuesday gave way toward evening, the blaze ceased to feel infinite, though it remained gigantic. Areas previously thought doomed were saved. Others still disappeared. Londoners began, in scattered places, to think beyond the next hour. Not because danger had passed, but because they sensed that survival was becoming imaginable. In catastrophe, this is a pivotal mental turn. Fear remains, but planning re-enters. People ask not only where to flee, but where to sleep, whom to find, how to account for losses, where to reclaim goods, whether servants have survived, whether customers or debtors can be traced, whether the parish will reform somewhere else, whether a burned trade can be resumed, whether friends are now poor, whether enemies are now ruined too. Fire had stripped London to emergency. Tuesday evening began, in the smallest ways, to restore chronology. Tomorrow existed again, and with it the burden of rebuilding. By Wednesday, the city had passed from combustion toward smoke, from movement toward counting. The main body of the fire was being checked, though pockets still burned fiercely and could not yet be trusted. The catastrophe was ending not with a theatrical final flare, but with exhaustion. One of the great truths of disaster is that its end can feel strangely anticlimactic to those who survive it. The imagination had been fixed on flames. Once flames retreat, the eye must adjust to blackened outlines, to walls standing without roofs, to chimneys rising alone, to stone shells where streets had been, to the smell of wet ash, hot lead, and splintered timber. The city that emerged from the fire was not empty. It was too damaged for emptiness. Instead, it was full of remains. Goods half saved and half ruined. Foundations exposed. Iron twisted. Cellars hot. Church bells cracked. Familiar routes erased. The violence of fire differs from that of war in one crucial respect. It can obliterate everyday structure while leaving the larger political frame intact. The monarchy still existed. The courts still existed. Commerce would return. Yet for the people walking the blackened lanes, that continuity could feel theoretical. The practical city, the one made of specific shops, known smells, habitual turns, and named neighbors, had vanished. The official tally later associated with the Great Fire, fewer than 10 deaths recorded, according to the London Museum's summary, has always startled readers. How could a catastrophe that destroyed so much have killed so few? Part of the answer lies in timing. Fires spread through property faster than through crowds if enough warning exists and if streets, river routes, and open fields remain available. Londoners fled. Families and goods clogged roads, because people mostly had time to move. But the low official death toll has also invited skepticism, and with reason. Pre-modern record-keeping was imperfect, and the poor often leave lighter paper trails than the propertied. Those who died in cellars, lanes, or makeshift shelters may not all have been cleanly counted. Some bodies may have been reduced beyond recognition in the fiercest zones. It is therefore safer to say that the recorded death toll was surprisingly low than to assert with total confidence that almost no one died. Catastrophe often kills socially as well as physically, and social death can be harder to count. Around 100,000 people, an enormous share of the city's population, were made homeless. Homelessness on that scale is not an after effect. It is part of the disaster itself. This displacement changed the meaning of London immediately. A capital defined by buildings and institutions had become a camp of the uprooted. The fields around the city, the roads leading out, and the surviving neighborhoods beyond the fire line now held people who had lost not only shelter but orientation. In ordinary life, address stabilizes identity. One belongs somewhere, pays somewhere, worships somewhere, owes and is owed somewhere. After the fire, all of those somewheres were uncertain for tens of thousands. The city had to continue functioning as a capital while a huge portion of its population lived in makeshift conditions. Food had to be supplied. Security had to be maintained. Disease, always feared after crowding and displacement, had to be considered. Ironically, the fire followed immediately upon the Great Plague of 1665, and some later Londoners would treat the sequence almost providentially, as if flame had cleansed what disease had afflicted. But such retrospective meaning-making should not obscure the raw reality of September 1666. People had lost homes, tools, papers, and routines in a city that still lacked modern welfare structures. Charity, parish support, patronage, and government response now had to fill gaps on a scale none had planned for. Wednesday also began the long political work of assigning meaning. Was this divine punishment? Negligence? Foreign sabotage? Catholic conspiracy? Wartime attack? Urban mismanagement? Ordinary accident magnified by bad luck? In a 17th century city, such questions were not mere commentary. They shaped violence, policy, and memory. Sermons sought providential explanations because fire on this scale invited theology as naturally as it invited smoke. Magistrates and officials sought legal explanations because someone, surely, had to bear blame. Crowds sought human enemies because catastrophe is easier to hate than to understand. The city's future would be shaped partly by how these narratives were answered or left unanswered. In that sense, the Great Fire was not over when the flames diminished. It was entering its second life, the life of interpretation. London had survived the heat. It now had to survive the stories that heat would generate. Among the most revealing witnesses to the fire are Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn. Not because they represent all Londoners, they do not, but because their writings show how literate, connected observers attempted to comprehend an event that exceeded ordinary categories. Pepys's diary is alive with movement. Boats on the Thames, anxious consultations, servant labor, official errands, meals interrupted by alarm, and the peculiar intimacy of domestic detail under public disaster. He is famous for burying his Parmesan cheese and wine in his garden to save them, a detail so humanly absurd and sensible that it has outlived many grander acts. Why preserve cheese while a city burns? Because catastrophe narrows judgment to what one can still control. Because in the midst of smoke, an object one values becomes a declaration that one intends to continue living afterward. Because history, despite later simplifications, is full of such choices. Evelyn, more elevated and reflective, gives us a different register. The sight of the city in flames, the sense of apocalypse, the scale of destruction viewed from distance. Together, these men show us how disaster creates multiple Londons at once. There is the London of state and logistics, the London of household improvisation, the London of moral interpretation, the London of spectacle, the London of loss. Pepys also reveals the role of information in catastrophe. Messages moved by conversation, letter, messenger, river, and direct observation. No central authority could provide instantaneous clarity. This meant that rumor had structural advantages. If one ward was burning, another still guessed at the line of danger. If foreigners had been seen acting suspiciously in one place, the story grew in retelling. If the king had issued an order, the city learned of it in fragments. Pre-modern urban life could be intensely social, but high social density does not guarantee accurate knowledge. It often guarantees fast, vivid, emotionally convincing knowledge instead. The Great Fire therefore belongs to the history of information as much as the history of flame. It is an example of how cities under pressure interpret themselves through rumor before institutions can catch up. One of the saddest and most politically consequential stories to emerge from the fire's aftermath was that of Robert Hubert, a troubled French watchmaker's son, sometimes described in sources as mentally unstable or at least unreliable, who confessed to starting the fire and was executed, despite evidence that made the confession impossible in literal terms. The British Library's modern account stresses that Hubert was wrongly blamed. His case reveals the desperation with which societies seek personified guilt after overwhelming disaster. Hubert was foreign, vulnerable, and narratively convenient in a city primed by war and anti-Catholic suspicion to imagine enemies in the shadows. That he could be made to stand for so vast an event tells us how little factual consistency matters once panic has found a symbolic culprit. London's need for explanation was greater than London's patience for truth. The anti-foreign violence and suspicion surrounding the fire should not be treated as an incidental side note. They exposed the social chemistry of urban fear. England in 1666 was at war with the Dutch, and anti-French and anti-Dutch sentiment moved easily through a city already trained to imagine Catholic plots and foreign subversion. In ordinary conditions, these hostilities might remain rhetorical. Under fire, they sharpened into bodily danger. Foreigners were beaten, accused, and sometimes nearly lynched. The city looked for arsonists not because evidence pointed clearly that way, but because scale itself seemed to demand agency. Ablaze, this devastating had to be someone's deed. The thought that a spark in a bakery, combined with wind and poor urban fabric, could destroy so much felt emotionally insufficient. This is a recurring feature of disasters. The human mind resists meaninglessness at scale. It seeks design, even malign design, where structural vulnerability would be the truer explanation. Yet structural vulnerability was indeed the explanation. London had built wealth in a form exquisitely vulnerable to flame. Wooden overhangs, dense plots, blocked lanes, lax or uneven enforcement of building rules, and the storage of dangerous goods within crowded urban districts all prepared the city for combustion. The Great Fire therefore belongs to a long history in which catastrophe reveals what prosperity has hidden about itself. Commercial energy and urban density made London powerful. The same qualities, left in certain materials and legal arrangements, made it burn magnificently. The fire's false conspiracies were easier to tell because the true explanation implicated everyone from landlords to magistrates, merchants to city planners, consumers to the ordinary habits of domestic heat. Accidents on that scale are morally unsatisfying because they blur guilt into system. As the flames died, London confronted a problem as old as cities and as modern as contract law. Who owned what now that so much of what had been owned was gone? Fire destroys buildings quickly, but legal relationships slowly. A burned house may still sit on land to which multiple claims attach: freeholder, leaseholder, creditor, tenant, neighbor, guild, parish, and heirs not yet in possession. Rent obligations, improvement rights, shared walls, easements, and customary uses do not vanish just because roof beams do. Yet the practical conditions that make such claims legible, documents, witnesses, familiar landmarks, continuous occupation, had been badly damaged. If London was to be rebuilt at anything like the speed required by necessity, it needed more than carpenters and brickmakers. It needed adjudication. The response was one of the most significant but less glamorous outcomes of the Great Fire: the creation of a special fire court, formerly the Court of Judicature for determining differences touching houses burned or demolished by the late fire. This institution, operating in the years after 1666, allowed disputes between landlords and tenants or others with competing interests to be resolved more rapidly than the ordinary courts might have managed. Its importance can hardly be overstated. Rebuilding a city is not only an architectural problem, it is a legal one. If every site remains tied up in ordinary litigation, reconstruction stalls, and the city loses not just buildings, but momentum. The fire court helped London avoid that paralysis. It embodied a principle that modern disaster governance still depends on. Exceptional damage may require exceptional procedures if social order is to be restored without endless litigation. At the same time, planning visions proliferated. The destruction of old London invited urban imagination. Here, for a brief moment, catastrophe opened the possibility of redesign. Men such as Christopher Wren, John Evelyn, and Robert Hooke proposed rational street plans, broader boulevards, geometric order, improved circulation, perhaps a more classical and less medieval capital rising from the ashes. One can see the temptation. What planner would not look at blackened ruin and think not only of restoration but of correction? The narrow lanes that had fed the fire might be replaced with broader streets. The haphazard medieval fabric might yield to something planned. Yet the future belongs not merely to geometry, but to property. However compelling grand designs appeared on paper, they collided with the urgency of resuming life and the complexity of existing claims. London could not wait years while every plot was reassembled into an ideal grid. Merchants needed to trade. Householders needed shelter. Institutions needed offices and churches and halls. The result was a compromise between vision and continuity. Some streets were widened. Building regulations changed. Materials changed. But the city was not remade according to a single rational master plan. It was rebuilt through negotiated adaptation. This distinction matters because myths of urban catastrophe often imagine that destruction grants total freedom to rebuild wisely. In truth, destruction grants urgency, and urgency favors what can be done rather than what can be perfectly designed. London after the fire did not become an ideal Baroque city like some on paper had imagined. It became something more historically revealing, an old commercial city rebuilt under new rules, with enough continuity to remain itself and enough change to become safer, more monumental, and more modern. Brick and stone replaced much of the timber construction that had made the old city so combustible. Regulations sought greater uniformity in wall thickness, party walls, and street alignment. The rebuilt St. Paul's and the city churches associated with Wren would eventually stamp the skyline with an architectural language the medieval city had not known. Yet beneath those transformations, London remained London, mercantile, crowded, litigious, improvised, ambitious. Catastrophe had not erased character. It had altered the material conditions under which character continued. The rebuilding, therefore, took time and came in layers. Immediate shelter had to be provided or improvised. Trade had to resume in provisional conditions. Then permanent reconstruction, often shaped by available capital and legal settlement, proceeded unevenly. Some owners were ruined. Some found opportunity. Fire redistributes advantage even as it destroys value. Those with liquidity, connections, and legal clarity could recover faster than those without. Thus, the Great Fire, for all its flattening force in the moment of danger, did not create equality in aftermath. It changed the city while reproducing hierarchy through different means. That too is part of how cities are remade, not only by what burns, but by who can afford to return first, rebuild better, and convert catastrophe into a new position within the urban order. No building better expresses the fire's transformation of London than St. Paul's Cathedral. The medieval cathedral that burned in 1666 was already a complex, burdened structure. It had suffered neglect, alteration, repair campaigns, and the wear of centuries. It was vast, familiar, and woven into London's identity. To lose it was to lose more than a church. It was to lose a point of orientation in both the skyline and the imagination. When the old cathedral burned, contemporaries witnessed not only destruction but succession. What would rise in its place? In that question lay the possibility of architectural reinvention on a scale far larger than any one private house. Christopher Wren's later cathedral, begun after the fire and completed decades afterward, is often treated as the triumphant answer. And in one sense it is. The new St. Paul's became one of the defining buildings of London, a dome of imperial self-confidence and Protestant grandeur. Yet it should also be understood as an argument about what kind of city London wished to become after catastrophe. The medieval cathedral had belonged to one urban world: guilds, processions, crowded churchyards, and a skyline of spires and towers in a city still architecturally tangled with the Middle Ages. Wren's St. Paul's belonged to another, more classical, more centralized, more in conversation with continental forms and restoration ambition. It declared that London would not merely recover, it would monumentalize recovery. That such a building could rise only over many years, amid political changes, financial constraints, and design revisions, is important. Reconstruction at this scale is always part hope, part stamina. Cities do not heal in a single plan. The same is true of the parish churches rebuilt after the fire. Their number and distribution mattered because parish life was one of the deep organizing principles of urban society. A church was not only a place of worship. It was a register of births, marriages, and deaths, a site of poor relief, a local landmark, a social rhythm. When 80 or so churches disappeared or were heavily damaged, the city lost not only sacred space, but neighborhood structure. Wren and his associates' rebuilding of many London churches therefore participated in a broader remaking of social geography. These new churches, each different yet sharing elements of a new architectural language, distributed post-fire identity across the city. They told Londoners that continuity was possible, but not through exact restoration. The old city would not return as it had been. It would return translated. This idea of translation is perhaps the most useful way to think about the Great Fire's architectural aftermath. London was not reborn from nothing. It was translated from one material and symbolic order into another. Timber became brick and stone. Medieval irregularity was moderated, not erased. Sacred landmarks reappeared in altered form. River commerce resumed along a waterfront that remembered destruction even as it moved goods again. The monument, begun in the 1670s and placed near the fire's origin, literalized this translation into memory. A city that had burned marked the point of ignition with stone and height, turning the site of vulnerability into a site of commemoration. That the monument initially included anti-Catholic inscriptions later removed or revised is revealing. Memory does not merely preserve. It edits, accuses, and makes politics of suffering. London's architecture after the fire therefore became a field of argument between memory and utility. How much of the old street pattern should remain? How wide should roads be? Which parishes deserved rebuilding? Which sites would be consolidated? How could commercial need be balanced with fire safety? Every answer produced not just a practical city, but a remembered one. The rebuilt capital did not allow itself to forget the catastrophe, yet it also refused to be governed wholly by it. The city could not remain a ruin, however morally vivid ruin might seem to later observers. It had to become ordinary again. The greatness of London's post-fire architecture lies partly in how it carried disaster forward without letting disaster become the only identity available. Wren's skyline and the rebuilding acts translated fear into form. They made the city safer and, at moments, grander. But they also encoded a lesson. Catastrophe can modernize by force what habit would have delayed. Another legacy of the Great Fire lay in the development of organized approaches to risk. Pre-modern London had firefighting tools and customs, but it did not possess a centralized professional fire service in the modern sense. The disaster exposed the insufficiency of ad hoc arrangements once urban density and commercial value reached a certain scale. In the decades after 1666, fire insurance companies developed more elaborate systems of identification and response. Fire marks placed on insured buildings signaled to company brigades which structures they were meant to protect. Historians sometimes debate how neat and effective these systems were in practice, and certainly they did not instantly create a modern fire service. Yet the broad point stands. The Great Fire accelerated thinking about urban catastrophe as something that could be managed institutionally, priced financially, and distributed through new forms of organization. This evolution is critical because it links the fire to the history of capitalism as much as to architecture. Insurance emerges most powerfully where risk becomes calculable enough to be collectivized and sold. The burning of thousands of buildings in the capital made risk visible on a scale that no prudent merchant, lender, or landlord could ignore. Property was no longer merely an object of ownership and rent. It was an object of actuarial imagination. What are the odds? What is the premium? Who bears the loss? How does a city whose prosperity depends on dense built form insure itself against the very density that makes it rich? These are not questions one asks in a village after a cottage fire. They are questions a commercial capital asks after 4 days of urban combustion. The Great Fire also influenced building codes and civic expectations in less formal ways. A city that had watched flame race through wooden projections now understood overhangs differently. A city that had seen narrow lanes become channels of heat now understood width as safety, not only as convenience. A city that had watched church bells melt and roofs collapse now understood the value of material resilience with new sharpness. Such understandings did not produce instant utopia. Land remained expensive. Builders economized. Regulations were obeyed unevenly. Yet the normative horizon shifted. London's rebuilt houses and streets were shaped by remembered danger. Once a city has seen how it burns, it cannot pretend that fire safety is merely theoretical. There is a political dimension to this institutionalization of risk. The Great Fire helped legitimate a more interventionist understanding of urban governance. If the city in its old form could destroy itself through a mix of combustible materials, weak enforcement, and delayed authority, then rulers and legislators had stronger grounds to shape building practice, adjudicate disputes, and regulate reconstruction. Modern readers accustomed to dense codes and municipal authority may miss how significant this was. 17th century cities balanced local custom, corporate privilege, property right, royal power, and parish responsibility in ways that made central rationalization difficult. The fire shifted that balance, if not completely, then meaningfully. Disaster became one of the arguments by which authorities could claim a right to intervene in the name of safety and public order. This did not mean London became a technocratic machine. Far from it. The rebuilt city remained socially chaotic, politically contested, and vulnerable to other forms of crisis. But after 1666, catastrophe was no longer simply an act of God, a random accident, or an inevitable hazard of urban life. It became something that could be anticipated, mitigated, and, crucially, blamed on the failure to anticipate and mitigate. This change in moral expectation matters. Once societies begin to think of disaster as governable, they begin to judge governments, institutions, and private actors by whether they prepared. The Great Fire therefore belongs to the early history of what we might call accountability through disaster. London's burning taught later city builders that saying, "fires happen," was no longer enough. The scale of destruction had made prevention a political requirement, even if prevention would never be perfect. In that sense, the fire did not merely destroy a city. It helped invent the modern expectation that cities should learn from being destroyed. The social geography of the Great Fire deserves to be seen clearly. Catastrophe is often narrated from the point of view of officials, diarists, and monuments because they leave the richest records. But London in 1666 was not only mayors, kings, surveyors, and men who kept journals. It was apprentices, watermen, seamstresses, dock laborers, domestic servants, widows, artisans, hawkers, porters, and children. Their experience of the fire can only partly be reconstructed, yet the structure of the city allows us to infer much. The wealthy could hire carts sooner, command labor more easily, and draw on networks of patronage outside the burning zone. Merchants with strong contacts could move goods to wharves or warehouses beyond danger. Gentry and office holders had country houses, inns, or friends to whom they might retreat. The poor, by contrast, often had little transport, little storage, and little legal documentation to anchor claims after loss. They carried what they could carry. They depended on family, parish charity, employers, or luck. In fields turned refugee camps, rank did not disappear, but misfortune compressed it into uncomfortable proximity. Women were central to this story. though records so often leave them half-named or relationally described. Housewives managed domestic evacuation. Female servants moved goods, woke households, and sometimes lost employment as houses and shops vanished. Widows, who in a city of trade and plague could already sit precariously between modest independence and poverty, faced renewed instability when property and customer networks burned. Market women and small traders whose capital existed in portable but vulnerable stocks saw the line between livelihood and destitution narrow within hours. At the same time, women's labor of holding households together under displacement, feeding children, preserving clothing, locating relatives, guarding salvaged goods, and negotiating temporary shelter, formed an unrecorded infrastructure of survival. The city could rebuild because families did not entirely dissolve in the fields and lanes beyond the fire. That continuity did not happen by magic. The fire also reveals how urban communities imagined responsibility. Parish and neighborhood mattered deeply in 17th-century London, and the destruction of parish churches and streets therefore meant more than the loss of landmarks. It meant the partial unmaking of local belonging. Who were your people when the church where your family worshipped was ash, when the lane where your trade was known no longer existed, when the houses whose residents could vouch for you were gone? Refugee status is not only material, it is social disembedding. The Great Fire produced tens of thousands of urban refugees without sending them into another country. They were displaced inside their own city's orbit. That kind of displacement is politically revealing because it tests whether civic identity can survive the temporary collapse of place. London, ultimately, did survive it. But survival required institutions, networks, and narratives that could hold people together while the built frame of their lives was missing. There is also a sensory dimension to the fire that historians must try not to lose. The event was not only seen. It was heard in cracking timbers, screaming crowds, bells, falling masonry, shouted orders, and the constant low violence of flame consuming a city. It was smelled in smoke, wet ash, scorched food, burned animals, molten lead, and the sickly sweetness of goods turned to cinder. It was felt in heat radiating across open spaces thought safe, in grit on skin and teeth, in the exhaustion of carrying and waiting and watching. Such sensory history matters because catastrophe changes perception before it changes interpretation. Londoners did not first understand the Great Fire as a historical event. They experienced it as a bodily invasion of ordinary life. Only later did it become a chapter, a sermon, a legal case, a commemorative monument, or an urban planning opportunity. At the time, it was a city turned hostile to breath and sleep. To narrate the Great Fire solely as a famous disaster is therefore too simple. It was a social sorting mechanism, a legal puzzle, a political test, and a sensory assault. It exposed inequalities already present and created new ones. It revealed hidden strengths in some institutions and weakness in others. It transformed geography into biography. Whether a person had to flee by boat, on foot, by cart, or not at all depended on class, location, trade, and luck. That is how cities burn in history, not as abstractions, but as uneven landscapes of danger in which every household learns what part of the social order it can actually rely on when walls begin to glow. The fire's timing within Restoration history amplified its significance. Charles II had been restored to the throne in 1660 after years of civil war, Republican experiment, and political volatility. Restoration England was trying to recover not only monarchy, but a sense of cultural and institutional continuity. The court cultivated display and pleasure. The capital resumed commercial expansion. Yet beneath the Restoration surface lay unresolved tensions: religion, memory of rebellion, distrust of standing authority, war expenditure, plague trauma, and the ongoing problem of how to govern a kingdom whose recent past had included the execution of a king. The Great Fire entered this unsettled world like a judgment. It demanded from the restored monarchy not pageantry but competence. Could the king protect his capital? Could royal authority do more than symbolize order? Could it produce it under extreme stress? Charles and James understood the political stakes intuitively. Accounts of their involvement during the fire and in its aftermath therefore carried reputational weight. James's energy in firefighting and organizing labor was later remembered in almost martial terms, as if urban catastrophe required princely courage akin to battlefield conduct. Charles's visibility mattered too. In a kingdom where the relationship between crown and city had long been politically charged, the Great Fire offered an opportunity for the monarchy to present itself as guardian rather than parasite. This did not settle deeper constitutional questions, but it helped shape the Restoration image of kingship as active, embodied, and necessary in crisis. A monarch who could appear in the streets while the capital burned might recover some of the trust that abstract government cannot command. At the same time, the disaster exposed the limits of all early modern governments. Neither crown nor city possessed a modern administrative apparatus capable of total command. Orders had to move through personal authority, office networks, and face-to-face coercion. Compliance depended on local willingness, labor availability, and the simple ability to cut through congestion. This is why the early hesitation over house demolition mattered so much. It was a problem born not only of one timid mayor, but of a state form that still negotiated with property rather than automatically overriding it. The Great Fire thus sits at a revealing point in the history of governance. It shows a polity capable of decisive action in moments, but not yet architected for systematic disaster management. The response was energetic, sometimes brave, and often improvised. It was not centralized in the modern sense because England in 1666 was not a centralized state in the modern sense. The fire also became entangled with the language of providence. 17th-century Englishmen and women did not naturally separate physical events from moral interpretation. A disaster of such scale invited sermons, days of fasting, public repentance, and speculation about divine meaning. Plague in 1665 and fire in 1666 created an almost unbearable sequence for those disposed to read history as God's correction. Was London being punished for vice, luxury, irreligion, political sin, or national pride? Such questions were not empty piety. They affected how communities sought comfort, how rulers framed response, and how the city remembered itself afterward. If the fire was punishment, rebuilding required not only architecture but repentance. If it was trial, survival required gratitude and reform. If it was deliverance from a worse plague, then loss might be folded into a providential logic that transformed grief into narrative coherence. These readings could coexist uneasily with practical reconstruction and anti-foreign paranoia. Human beings are capable of believing in providence, conspiracy, negligence, and meteorology all at once, especially in catastrophe. London did. Political and providential readings converged in commemorative culture. The monument to the Great Fire, with its position near the site of ignition and its carefully designed symbolism, turned a point of vulnerability into a point of remembrance and instruction. It also participated in blame. Early inscriptions reflected anti-Catholic sentiment and the desire to inscribe a cause into stone that later generations would contest or remove. This reminds us that monuments are never neutral. They are arguments in material form. The Great Fire's memory was shaped from the start by people who wanted the city not merely to recall destruction, but to understand who or what had destroyed it. The city rebuilt itself physically and narratively at once. Restoration London rising from the ashes was not just a story of resilience. It was a story of choosing which explanations deserved to harden into public memory. This choice had consequences. To make the fire solely an act of providence risked obscuring administrative failure and urban vulnerability. To make it solely foreign sabotage risked justifying xenophobic violence and legal injustice. To make it solely accidental risked missing the moral and structural conditions that had prepared the city to burn so completely. The richness of the Great Fire as history lies precisely in this conflict of meanings. It is an urban disaster, but also a test of how a political society explains itself when one of its central places is almost erased. The war context of 1666 sharpened every edge of interpretation. England was in the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and maritime rivalry with the Dutch Republic shaped not only strategy, but public imagination. Commerce, naval conflict, colonial competition, and Protestant rivalry all flowed into the emotional atmosphere of London. In such a climate, It was easy to believe that enemies might strike at the capital by covert means. News traveled slowly enough and unreliably enough that fear could outrun verification. The same city that depended on maritime trade also feared maritime enemies. Thus, warehouses of imported goods, wharves loaded with overseas commodities, and riverside labor all stood at the intersection of prosperity and danger. The fire, starting near the Thames and feeding on commercial stores, seemed almost staged by history to connect the city's wealth with the war that threatened it. This wartime backdrop helps explain why foreigners became immediate targets. French and Dutch residents or passers-by could find themselves accused on the slightest pretext. A strange tool, an odd accent, the wrong place at the wrong hour, and fear did the rest. Some attacks were opportunistic violence dressed as patriotism. Others came from genuine panic. Authorities tried, not always successfully, to calm the city and prevent mob rule from turning disaster into massacre. But their task was nearly impossible because the fire itself was making ordinary evidentiary judgment seem inadequate. If one city is burning beyond any remembered precedent, moderation becomes a luxury. This does not excuse anti-foreign attacks. It helps explain their scale and speed. Panic seeks moral economy, and in wartime that economy is often nationalized. At a deeper level, the Great Fire exposed London's dependence on systems larger than itself. Food, fuel, building materials, and trade goods moved through regional, national, and international networks. Once the city burned, it needed those same networks to survive and rebuild. Timber, stone, brick, lime, labor, legal expertise, credit, and political support all had to be mobilized across England and beyond. Thus, the disaster that seemed to reveal London's vulnerability also displayed its centrality. The kingdom could not simply let the capital remain a field of ruins. Its commercial, political, and symbolic importance required recovery. This imperative helps explain the speed with which rebuilding measures, financial mechanisms, and legal interventions were developed. London was not one city among many. It was the heart of a growing fiscal, military, and commercial state. Its destruction threatened more than local lives. Yet the dependence ran both ways. The fire damaged the mechanisms through which England's wider ambitions were financed and coordinated. Merchants lost stock. Offices lost records. Port functions were disrupted. Governmental routines had to be recited or improvised. If one thinks of London as the server through which the kingdom's early modern power increasingly processed itself, then the Great Fire was not merely a local hardware failure. It was a national systems shock. That England could absorb it and continue on a path toward greater commercial and imperial strength is one reason the fire later entered Whiggish stories of resilience and improvement. But such stories should not be allowed to retroactively soothe the terror of the moment. Survivors did not know they were standing inside a narrative of eventual imperial ascent. They knew only that the capital was burning, that their houses were gone, and that tomorrow's order had not yet been invented. The city's material transformation after the fire would, over decades, contribute to London's capacity to become a more durable imperial capital. Wider streets in places, more brick and stone, new churches, a monumental cathedral, improved legal and financial mechanisms, and a growing culture of insurable property all helped shape a city more suited to the scale of its ambitions. In that sense, the Great Fire belongs not only to the history of London, but to the history of Britain's rise as a global power. Catastrophe accelerated modernization in forms no one would have chosen in advance, but many later benefited from. This does not make the fire a hidden blessing. It makes it one of those brutal historical episodes in which destruction and development become entangled beyond the comfort of simple moral categories. The same entanglement appears in individual stories. Some merchants were ruined beyond recovery. Others, better capitalized or better connected, re-entered trade and perhaps even profited from demand generated by rebuilding. Craftsmen lost shops and tools, but builders, brickmakers, carters, surveyors, masons, glaziers, and laborers also found years of work in reconstruction. Property owners saw value destroyed, yet some sites, once rebuilt, gained from improved materials or more favorable urban conditions. Disaster redistributed not only suffering but opportunity, and that redistribution followed existing lines of class and power unevenly. A city remade by fire is not remade equally. It is remade through the bargaining power, credit access, and legal position of those trying to return. London's transformation after 1666 therefore reveals the raw politics of urban resilience. Recovery is never just courage. It is also capital. There is a temptation, when telling the story of the Great Fire, to arrange it too neatly by days. Sunday, spread. Monday, catastrophe. Tuesday, resistance. Wednesday, relief. The lived experience was less orderly. Time in disaster stretches and folds. Hours become years. Whole afternoons vanish into carrying, shouting, waiting, rowing, lifting, coughing, counting, and turning to see if the orange line has moved closer. Many Londoners later remembered not the sequence of official events, but the textures of interruption. The meal left untouched, the chest that proved too heavy, the cart that never returned, the servant who got separated in the crowd, the church bell one had heard every week now melting somewhere beyond smoke. This dimension matters because history's large patterns are always built from such small fractures in ordinary continuity. Think of the booksellers around St. Paul's. London's print world in the 17th century clustered heavily in and around the cathedral precinct, where books, pamphlets, sermons, and legal works circulated through a dense commercial ecosystem. When the fire approached, some believed the cathedral's stone fabric might protect stored stock. Instead, the opposite happened. Fire found the scaffolding and combustible materials of repair works, and the district's concentration of books turned paper into tinder for memory itself. There is something almost unbearably symbolic in that. A city's written culture gathered around its great cathedral, feeding the blaze that would consume both. But symbolism should not obscure material loss. Printed books represented money, learning, religious controversy, legal utility, and the reproduction of intellectual life. To lose them was to lose not only inventory, but the means by which arguments and institutions sustained themselves. The Great Fire therefore belongs to the history of knowledge as well as architecture. It destroyed stores of text in a city that increasingly lived by text. It also belongs to the history of infrastructure. Streets, bridges, water access, and urban geometry are usually background to political and social narrative. Under fire, they become protagonists. London Bridge, with buildings still upon it, posed its own danger, but a gap left from an earlier fire helped prevent the Great Fire from crossing to the south in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Here chance, previous damage, and urban form intersected. A city can be saved by the scars of former disasters. Elsewhere, narrow lanes acted as flues, accelerating heat and channeling sparks. Proximity between river commerce and domestic housing multiplied fuel pathways. One sees in all this how the built environment stores risk invisibly until a triggering event makes the storage visible. Modern urbanists speak of resilience, hazard mapping, and cascading infrastructure failure. London in 1666 did not have those terms, but it had the reality. There is also the question of animals, often neglected in fire narratives focused on human agency. Horses pulled carts until streets became impassable. Dogs, cats, and caged birds entered households' decisions about what could be carried. Livestock kept in urban spaces or nearby perished or had to be moved. River traffic depended on laboring animals and human crews alike. In a city where everyday life was never purely human, catastrophe was likewise multi-species. The smell of a great urban fire included more than timber and goods. This is not sentimentality. It is part of reconstructing what total urban combustion means in a pre-industrial world. The Great Fire also altered the politics of visibility between rich and poor. In ordinary times, elite life in London could maintain a degree of privacy through architecture, servants, and controlled access. Under catastrophe, wealth became visible as cargo. One could see what households valued by what they dragged into the street. Chests of plate, fine furnishings, and trunks of clothing announced rank even in distress. So too did the means of transport one could command. Yet visibility cut both ways. The poor, too, became newly visible as a mass of exposed bodies in need of space, bread, and security. Fields beyond the city contained not a faceless crowd, but the urban population made legible by loss. That spectacle of common vulnerability may have deepened some charitable impulses, but it also sharpened fears of disorder. Refugees are never interpreted only as victims. They are also perceived, by authorities and property holders, as crowds requiring management. Thus, relief and discipline tend to arrive together. This tension persisted into the rebuilding years. London needed labor, but it also needed order. It needed compassion, but it also needed adjudication. It needed to help the displaced, but it also needed to protect credit and ownership if commerce was to resume. The city's response therefore fused mercy with legalism. Collections were raised. Shelter was improvised. But at the same time, surveys were conducted, claims assessed, sites marked, and rebuilding classified. Modern readers sometimes imagine humanitarian and bureaucratic response as opposites. In urban catastrophe, they are often twins. Without records, maps, and judgments, compassion can become aimless. Without compassion, records and maps become cruelty. London's slow return from fire depended on both. By the time rebuilding laws were passed, London's destruction had already become an opportunity for argument about what a capital should look like. This was not merely an aesthetic debate. It was about circulation, hierarchy, defense, and commerce. Wider streets could help check future fires and facilitate transport. More regular building lines could make the city easier to navigate and govern. Brick and stone could reduce fire risk, while also signaling greater permanence and dignity. Yet these ideals collided with the granular realities of ownership. In a city where plots had histories, leases had years yet to run, and livelihoods depended on precise locations, radical replanning risked producing as much social damage as safety. The London that emerged was therefore neither the untouched medieval city nor the clean geometrical vision some reformers imagined. It was a compromised city, and compromise is one of the true signatures of durable urban history. Compromise does not sound heroic, but in London's case it was creative. The Rebuilding Act classified houses by street width and location, prescribing materials and forms in ways that balanced ambition with feasibility. The use of brick and stone increased. Timber overhangs were curtailed. Party walls became more substantial. The city's skin thickened. This was not modern planning in the later bureaucratic sense, but it was more than mere restoration. London learned in law what it had learned in flame. Material choices are political choices. A beam, a wall thickness, a lane width, a roof form. These are not only technical details. They are decisions about what risks a city is willing to carry into the future. Christopher Wren's fame can make it seem as if one man rebuilt London by force of genius. That is a charming distortion. Wren was indispensable as surveyor, designer, and symbolic architect, especially through St. Paul's and many parish churches, but rebuilding a city is always plural labor. Surveyors marked lines. Masons laid stone. Brickmakers fed kills. Carpenters returned in new material contexts. Clerks tracked claims. Judges untangled disputes. Laborers hauled rubble and supplies. Women managed households and temporary lodgings while waiting on settlements and wages. The city rose because thousands of practical acts accumulated under a new framework. Cathedrals attract the eye. Cities are really rebuilt in contracts, carts, brickfields, and routine. The fire's relationship to class deepened during Reconstruction. Those with capital could rebuild sooner, perhaps to improve standards that reinforce status. Those without capital might remain dependent on landlords' decisions or be forced into different neighborhoods altogether. This is another way in which catastrophe remakes cities. It can preserve the overall hierarchy while redistributing individuals within it, creating winners and losers not only from the fire itself, but from the speed of return. London's post-fire map was not just physically altered, it was socially edited. Some trades clustered again where they had before, because convenience and market logic pulled them back. Others shifted. Temporary arrangements became permanent in ways no one had intended during the emergency. Once a city is uprooted, even partially, the old pattern can never be restored exactly because memory and necessity do not align perfectly. There is a broader historical irony here. The Great Fire is often remembered as one of the great disasters of English history, and rightly so. Yet many of the features later generations admire in central London's post-medieval cityscape owe something to that disaster. The skyline of Wren churches, the rebuilt St. Paul's, more durable building materials, and a stronger culture of urban regulation all emerged through the necessity created by destruction. This should not tempt us into easy redemption narratives. It should instead remind us how often cities are modernized by trauma. Improvement is not always chosen under peaceful conditions. Sometimes it is forced by the unbearable visibility of what older forms can no longer safely sustain. When London later faced other fires, other riots, other bombings, and even the aerial destruction of the Blitz, the memory of 1666 lingered as comparison and warning. The city that had once burned so thoroughly became a city that remembered burning as part of its identity. That memory shaped expectations of endurance. Londoners could say, in later centuries, that the city had burned before and survived. Such phrases sound stoic and almost simple, but they are built on an enormous archival weight of suffering, loss, improvisation, and rebuilding. The Great Fire entered English civic mythology as proof that London, however often struck, could remake itself. Myths of resilience are never purely false. They are what societies say when they have already decided that rebuilding is not optional. The Great Fire also changed the relationship between London and memory in a more intimate sense. Before 1666, the city's past was embedded materially in streets, parish boundaries, old halls, medieval alignments, churchyards, and buildings layered with use. After the fire, memory had to work harder because so many of its physical anchors were gone. People could still point and say a street had once run here, a chapel had once stood there, a relative had once traded in that lane, but the built proof had become ash. In such circumstances, diaries, maps, engravings, sermons, legal papers, and oral testimony acquire special power. The city had to remember itself through representation because so much immediate physical continuity had been broken. This is one reason the Great Fire became unusually well narrated. It was not only that the event was large, it was that the city required stories, images, and records to reconnect itself to what had just vanished. Maps of the burned area and proposed rebuilding plans thus did more than guide reconstruction. They became acts of civic self-recognition. They translated chaos into line and ownership into geometry. In a city where one could walk across ruin and no longer know precisely where one parish ended and another lane began, the map restored argument to sight. Yet maps are selective. They flatten smells, noise, and grief. They show plots, not panic. The history of the Great Fire, therefore, needs both cartography and voice. The plan view explains how much burned. Pepys explains what it felt like to watch flame move. The law records explain how disputes were resolved. The monument explains how official memory wished to harden itself. No one source is enough because the event occurred at too many scales at once. The city's literary and visual culture after the fire also reveals how disasters become usable. Engravings turned burning London into spectacle. Sermons made it moral. Official texts made it instructive. Personal writings made it intimate. Each of these forms did political work. They told Londoners what kind of event they had survived, and therefore what kind of city they now inhabited. Was this a chastened city? A providentially spared city? A city tested and improved? A city betrayed by negligence? Different groups answered differently, and those answers shaped subsequent policy and public feeling. Memory is not the residue of event. It is one of the ways societies continue fighting over event after the flames are out. There is also an imperial future lurking behind the ashes. London in the later 17th and 18th centuries would grow into an ever more powerful imperial and financial metropolis. That later city often projects backward into the way the Great Fire is remembered. We are tempted to see the blaze as a brutal but productive clearing of medieval congestion, a necessary prelude to metropolitan greatness. Such teleology is dangerous. It makes suffering look functional and strips contingency out of history. The fire did not burn in order that empire might have a more durable capital. It burned because a bakery ignited under the wrong conditions in a city dangerously built. Yet once the event occurred, it did shape the environment in which later growth happened. To deny that would be false. The correct stance is not redemption, but entanglement. Destruction and later greatness were linked, but not by benevolence. They were linked by the hard mechanics through which cities metabolize catastrophe into new forms. This entanglement helps explain why the Great Fire still fascinates. It offers everything historical narrative loves: a dramatic ignition, named witnesses, vivid villains both real and false, a city under visible assault, royal appearances, mob suspicion, architectural rebirth, and long memory. But fascination should not let us overlook the stubborn plainness at the core of the story. London burned because ordinary vulnerabilities had been left in place long enough to feel ordinary. That is the deepest and most modern lesson of 1666. Catastrophe often enters through the familiar. The bakery oven, the timber wall, the stored commodity, the narrow lane, the legal hesitation, the windy night. None of these is extraordinary on its own. Together, they become world-changing. The Great Fire is therefore not just a tale of flame. It is a tale of accumulation. Cities are always accumulating risk, usually invisibly, until a spark reveals the pattern all at once. The phrase, "the 4 days that remade a city," is useful so long as we remember that remaking did not end on the 4th day. Fire works quickly, consequence works slowly. For months and years after 1666, Londoners continued negotiating what the disaster meant in kitchens, counting houses, courtrooms, churches, and council chambers. Children who had watched carts of goods roll into Moorfields would grow up in neighborhoods built of brick, where older people still spoke the names of vanished lanes. Clergy preached in temporary spaces while waiting for parish churches to rise. Merchants resumed trade in provisional warehouses before permanent addresses were restored. Household servants and apprentices who had spent days guarding salvage learned that catastrophe could interrupt social rank but not abolish it. Even the city's smells changed. A rebuilt London smelled of mortar, fresh timber, kiln-fired brick, wet plaster, and construction, not only of commerce and domestic life. Cities after fire are half workshop, half memory. One underappreciated consequence of the Great Fire was the way it reordered time in the legal and emotional imagination of property. A house before the fire had a past attached to it. Who built it? Who rented it? What obligations clung to it? How long a lease had yet to run? Which family incidents had unfolded within it? After the fire, property became at once more abstract and more precious. A burned site could now be valued for future potential rather than inherited familiarity. This shift favored those most comfortable with speculation, credit, and long-term investment. Catastrophe can therefore modernize not just material fabric, but the mentality of ownership. One no longer owns only a house. One owns a rebuilding opportunity or a legal claim. The city becomes, in part, a field of future-oriented calculation. That calculation helped London recover, but it also pushed it further toward a world in which money, survey, and legal abstraction increasingly shaped urban life. The Great Fire's afterlife in popular memory also tells us something about England's relationship to disaster. Unlike military defeats, which can humiliate a nation politically, urban catastrophes often invite narratives of endurance. The fire burned the capital, but London survived. It could thus be retold as proof of civic tenacity. Yet this resiliency narrative sits uneasily alongside the event's raw dependence on luck. Had the wind blown differently, had demolition begun earlier, had London Bridge not possessed the break left by earlier fire, had the blaze jumped more fully southward, the scale could have been even worse. Resilience is often hindsight laid over contingency. Londoners rebuilt, yes. They also benefited from the fact that catastrophe eventually encountered limits. To acknowledge contingency is not to diminish endurance. It is to resist the vanity by which later societies imagine themselves morally destined to survive what in truth they survived through a mixture of effort, material capacity, and chance. There is a modern temptation to compare every great urban disaster to later ones and measure significance by body count or media coverage. In such comparisons, the Great Fire can seem strangely remote, even almost tidy, because 17th century evidence is patchier and the recorded death toll lower than intuition expects. But magnitude should not be judged narrowly. The fire destroyed much of the medieval city of London, displaced a huge population, disrupted the kingdom's central commercial and political hub, transformed architecture, law, insurance, and urban governance, and entered cultural memory with almost mythic force. Few disasters so completely joined the physical, social, legal, and symbolic life of a city into one event. That is why it remains central not only to London history, but to urban history more broadly. It shows how an old city can be simultaneously vulnerable and adaptive, how catastrophe can reveal everything a city was made of, and how rebuilding can preserve identity only by altering it. In that sense, the Great Fire belongs to a larger pattern visible across world history. Cities rise because they concentrate people, goods, energy, and ambition. Those same concentrations make them vulnerable. Fire, plague, riot, flood, earthquake, bombardment, and financial collapse all exploit density in different ways. What survives is not usually the old city intact, but the urban will to continue under new terms. London in 1666 joined San Francisco in 1906, Chicago in 1871, Lisbon in 1755, and many others in that long history of cities taught by violence how they were built. But London's fire remains distinctive because the city it transformed would go on to become one of the dominant capitals of the modern world. To watch it burn in 1666 is therefore to witness not a backwaters tragedy, but a future metropolis nearly unmade before it fully became itself. There is one more angle from which the Great Fire must be seen, not only as a disaster that happened to London, but as a disaster through which London learned what kind of capital it had become. In earlier centuries, cities could burn and still remain, but 17th century London was already something larger than a walled medieval town. It was becoming the administrative and commercial heart of a polity with expanding global interests. Its waterfront connected England to Europe, the Atlantic, and beyond. Its merchants financed ventures that reached across oceans. Its printers, lawyers, office holders, and court culture concentrated national life in ways that made the city's physical vulnerability politically dangerous. The Great Fire forced contemporaries to confront that mismatch. A city of such importance could not go on building as if density were free, records infinitely recoverable, and wooden overhangs a harmless inheritance from the past. If London wished to remain what it was becoming, it had to harden. Hardening, however, did not mean sterilization. The rebuilt city still bustled, swore, smelled, and crowded. Taverns still filled. Markets still shouted. Apprentices still jostled. Street sellers still cried their wares. Wharves still loaded goods under hard weather. Rebuilding altered materials and regulations, but it did not turn London into a clean diagram. This is another reason the Great Fire is such a rich subject. It produced modernization without perfection, reform without purity. The city became safer in certain ways and remained risky in others. Such partial transformation is closer to the truth of urban history than the fantasies of total renewal catastrophe sometimes inspires. Even old age and posterity did not settle the fire into a single meaning. 18th century Londoners could look back on 1666 as a founding wound of their modern city. 19th century antiquarians used it to mourn what medieval London had lost and admire what Wren's London had gained. 20th century Londoners, especially after the Blitz, encountered the fire through analogies of endurance under destruction. During the Second World War, when St. Paul's famously survived bombing and became a symbol of national morale, memories of 1666 flickered in the background. A city that had once watched old St. Paul's burn now watched new St. Paul's stand amid smoke. History had become comparison. In our own time, the fire is taught to children through rhyme and reenactment, explored in museums, marked by the monument, and walked physically through a city whose financial district still sits on the footprint of the burn zone. Few events in urban history have been so continuously available to public memory. But availability can breed simplification. Schoolbook versions often reduce the fire to a neat moral fable: a bakery, a windy night, a lot of wooden houses, then rebuilding. The real story is rougher and more revealing. It involves administrative hesitation, royal intervention, xenophobic blame, legal innovation, class difference, sensory overload, supply chains, church politics, architectural ambition, and the stubborn necessity of compromise. It is one of those rare events where nearly every scale of history matters at once. Household decisions matter. Street geometry matters. Wind direction matters. Royal personality matters. International war matters. Property law matters. Theology matters. To tell the story well is to allow all those scales to remain visible together, because that is how the people inside the event experienced it. as an overwhelming convergence of forces no single explanation can contain. Perhaps that is why the Great Fire still feels alive. Fire is among the oldest human fears, and a city in flames is among the oldest human visions of social collapse. Yet London in 1666 also offers something else: the possibility that destruction, while never redeemable, can still be answered by intelligence, labor, law, and civic endurance. Not quickly, not cleanly, not equally, but truly. The city that emerged from the ashes was not the same one that had burned. It could not be. Too much had been lost, too many streets erased, too many materials transformed into smoke. But it was recognizably London, and in some respects more London than before, more conscious of its scale, more disciplined in its building, more monumental in its skyline, more prepared to think of itself as a capital whose vulnerability had to be governed. The fire remade London because London chose to remain London under new conditions. In the end, the Great Fire endures because it illuminates a truth that every large city prefers to forget while ordinary life is functioning. Urban confidence is often built on invisible bargains with danger. London before 1666 had bargained with timber, congestion, combustible commerce, and fragmented authority. The bargain mostly held, until it did not. Once broken, it revealed how much of the city's prosperity had depended on treating hazard as background noise. The same is true in different forms for cities across history. They bargain with rivers, fault lines, heat, debt, crowding, old pipes, neglected bridges, speculative building, brittle supply chains, and aging infrastructure. Most days those bargains seem reasonable because most days disaster does not arrive. Then one night a spark catches, or one morning the ground moves, or one season the water rises, and the bargain is exposed all at once. That is why the Great Fire never quite leaves us. It is ancient, but it is also contemporary in the deepest way. It tells every city that density is power and danger together. It also tells us something about memory and scale. 4 days is an absurdly short period in which to lose so much of a capital. Yet those 4 days are not intelligible without the decades that built the city before them and the decades that rebuilt it after them. The fire therefore sits in historical time like an explosion that can only be understood through compression and extension at once. Everything narrowed into hours, orders, winds, burning districts, fleeing families. Everything widened into generations, laws, buildings, economic habits, monuments, stories. This duality is one reason the event remains so compelling to narrate. It offers the urgency of crisis and the depth of transformation. One can tell it minute by minute or century by century and still be telling the same story from different altitudes. For Londoners of 1666, of course, none of this larger reflection softened the immediate loss. They had to cough through smoke, drag what they could carry, watch roofs fall, endure fields of displacement, fear thieves and foreigners and the weather and tomorrow's hunger, and then begin the work of arguing over what remained. Historical meaning is always generous compared with lived catastrophe. That imbalance should make us modest. We admire resilience partly because we are not the ones burying cheese in the garden, rowing trunks along a river, or sleeping among salvaged goods under a wet September sky. To honor the Great Fire honestly is to resist turning suffering too quickly into legend. And yet legend is unavoidable because the city that rose afterward carried the fire in stone. It carried it in St. Paul's Dome, in the legal memory of the fire court, in the monument's height, in the preference for brick, in street widths, in insurance logic, in the city's confidence that it could be broken and remain itself. Every later Londoner who repeated some version of the phrase that London had burned and rebuilt was living inside that inheritance. The Great Fire did not merely happen in London. It happened to the idea of London, and the idea survived by changing. That is why the event still deserves its place not only in English history, but in the history of cities everywhere. It shows how a capital can be forced through terror into a new material form, and how that new form can still carry the memory of what was lost. So the fire begins, as so many famous events do, in an almost ordinary way. A bakery, a sleeping city, a spark. Then weather, material, and hesitation enlarge the ordinary into the unforgettable. A city runs, prays, curses, saves what it can, blames the wrong men, loses churches and records and homes, and stares at a skyline it no longer knows. Then, slowly, from ash, law, labor, and argument, it builds another London. Not a better city in every moral sense, not a safer city against every future danger, but a different city, harder, more regulated, more monumental, more modern. That is what 4 days did. They did not merely destroy a city. They forced it to decide what could return, what could not, and what had to be invented in between. The Great Fire of London was therefore not only a catastrophe. It was an urban turning point so complete that the city after it must be read through the city before it. And the city before it can only fully be understood by the flames that revealed what it had been made of.
you.